This is your lecture on learning perspectives in a nutshell. I originally created this lecture for a San Jose State University faculty retreat, and I made it as entertaining as I could. I wanted to make it amusing as well as interesting, but also to be very practical. The Learning Perspectives in a Nutshell title is based on the idea that I have used pictures and examples from training to puppies to illustrate the different learning perspectives. The learning perspectives are also sometimes known as learning theories. But since there really isn't one single theory that explains all of human learning or other animals' learning, the idea of perspectives lets us blend them together, lets us use them more practically, I believe, as do many other people. The learning perspectives concept opens up our minds a bit more to the idea that we can learn in more than one way. So we need to teach in more than one way. And the learning perspectives concept helps us to be self aware that we are actually teaching and learning just about every minute we're awake, and even sometimes when we're asleep. But I use the dogs to illustrate the learning perspectives because, well, they're cute, and it is also research documented that looking at pictures of cute things or nature based things can actually lower your blood pressure and increase your IQ. In other words, they can help you learn better. I didn't cite that research in this lecture, but I will share it with you on our learning management system if you ask for it. So I started off with Tommy. Tommy was born in December of 2010. I got him from a neighbor when he was 3 months old, and he was the first puppy that I've ever had as an adult. I've always rescued older dogs who had problems, but they were already had some basic training, and they were also a lot lower energy. Tommy turned out to be very high energy and very challenging. So he was a very good example. He also turned out to be one of the most intelligent dogs I've ever had. Of all the dogs I've ever had, he is on tie with my first dog as being the quickest to learn and also the most dangerous with his learning because he learned things from us and from other animals and other people that maybe we didn't want him to learn, that were not really safe things for a little dog to learn. So I asked for some advice from some very good friends of mine who are professional dog trainers. And the books that you see here in the picture I bought them from one of my friends who is a dog trainer, and it's training levels, steps to basically train a dog who's very intelligent, very eager, very interactive. And I got these books, and I'm like, okay, now what do I do? And my caption says, Tommy has his textbooks, but how can he learn from them? Can I? Can you? How do we take what's just in a textbook and turn it in from teaching to learning, from the paper to action? Here's Tommy teaching. He's actually looking at me. You can see his eyes. He's just a little over a year old in this picture. He's unhappy. He's gotten up on my desk. He knows exactly when I'll say, wait till I'm done working and we'll go walkies. And he knows exactly when I've stopped working and now I'm on Facebook, as you can see in the overhead here and the slide here. This is a very context kind of specific teaching. He's teaching me by looking at me and communicating to me that he's unhappy. He knows I've switched to Facebook. Notice he's on my desk. He jumped up on my desk so he could look at me. And he's also learned how to use facial expressions to communicate with me, a human. Consider this a teachable moment. Consider how teaching and learning require communicating. I have talked to professional dog trainers who say, yes, dogs teach us too. And it's really interesting how he learned how to communicate with the primate, with the human, me, by using those facial expressions. A lot of really interesting research on that. And using PowerPoint, so learned thing for me. I have not really used it, and I'm now using it in this recording. I ended up having to use Camtasia to record this because I was challenged in getting PowerPoint to record audio that I could convert to a web standard format, but I'll figure it out someday. So our first learning perspective is the behavioral perspective. The idea of psychology of learning or educational psychology perspectives, they all address the same things. What is teaching? What is learning? And all the sub issues that go along with understanding what is teaching and what is learning and how we do it or how we don't do it. How do we fail to learn? The behavioral perspective is what many people assume that dog trainers do. Um, it is often unfairly maligned because of some aspects of it, and it is much more complex than this one sentence can really convey to you. B.F. Skinner was the researcher who really codified this idea of the behavioral perspective, and it describes teaching and learning through something called operant conditioning, which is both negative and positive feedback, both rewards and punishments. And I think the idea of punishments is what's made it have a negative reputation. But negative feedback, you didn't do a good job, or I can't, it's hard for me to say since he's sitting right here, but if I say bad dog, Tom knows that he's not, that he knows from my tone of voice, he knows from having learned in the past that I'm not happy with his behavior. That is, we're able to give back both negative and positive feedback, and we learn by what behaviors are being rewarded and what behaviors are having negative feedback. There's been some abuse of that kind of teaching and learning in the past, and if you want to read more about it, the slides for this are in the along with the recording, and you can click through on the behavioral perspective and read a lot more about it. It's very interesting, and in fact, we are actually using some aspects of that with the dog training. He gets a treat when he sits and waits. He gets petted on the head when he gets his neck scratched, or he gets walkies when he asks for them in the right way. He gets rewarded. The other perspective, the developmental perspective, I've noticed over the years a lot of librarians get sort of stuck on Jean Piaget. He did most of his research with his own children. The idea is that as other animals, grow and develop, we are able to learn things in a what's the word I want? As we grow, we are able to learn specific things that are based on our developmental level. We grow, we expand. We're able to learn more as we develop. And that is actually pretty easy to document. It makes a whole lot of sense. When we were, very small, we didn't have the same communications tools, or our brains hadn't developed to a certain extent. So again, you can click through and read more about that developmental perspective. It is a very good, in my opinion, basis on which to consider learning. It's when we are looking at instructional design and we're looking at who are we designing for, the entry behaviors and learner characteristics step, for example, or our needs assessment. At what developmental level of learning ability are our learners? And when Tommy was a year old, I decided he really needed a playmate his own age. My older rescue dog at the time was not able to keep up with him, and she was becoming ill and very unhappy with his energy level. So we went and got Tommy a little 3-month-old puppy to keep him company from another rescue. And she's a sort of Shih Tzu Lhasa-ish. She looks more like a spaniel to me now, but this is her at 4 months. And she was learning with operant conditioning to come when she was called. She learned her name, and she learned sit, wait, come, down, go. And she was just a baby. And after she had, even with her favorite treats, which was cheese, If she had been learning too long and she was tired, she tried to come. She tried really hard, as you can see how she's draped out of her bed. She's trying to come, but her body is just too young and too tired out. And that tired out part's important too, to obey. But she did look up. I said, come, and I said her name, and she looked up. I gave her cheese for this partial effort, which is also important, being rewarded for trying. It's another thing about the behavioral perspective that's important. What gets rewarded? Not always the complete success or mastery, but the steps. You get rewarded for doing pieces of the learning going forward. And the developmental stage as a 4-month-old baby, a baby puppy, granted, she just didn't have the physical ability to follow through. She's not ever going to be punished. She might have negative reinforcement, meaning if she does something like pee on the rug, I will say BADDOG and I will not reward her. Actually, some people say that the best way of doing that with a dog is to ignore their behavior. Just clean it up and don't reward it, but very heavily reward it when, for example, I've trained mine to ring bells at the back door, which leads out of my office. If they ring the bell to go out, then they used to get treats. Now they ring the bell and going out is their reward. Interestingly enough, I acquired a new used cat a couple months ago, and that cat observed the dogs and learned how to ring the bell within 3 days of him coming into our household. That was really amazing to us. I'm going to get a picture of it sometime and share it in this lecture. The cognitive perspective on learning is where I actually began my studies back when I was doing a master's degree in educational psychology, which is where I started. I didn't finish that master's degree. I switched to library science and then later went back and got a degree in educational technology. But I actually got to listen to Jerome Bruner at a lecture live and got to ask questions and participate in a seminar with him. And I was very impressed. Intuitively, the cognitive perspective appeals to me. I think it appeals to many people. The idea is we remember what we learn and we use what we've learned in the past to learn new skills. We build on our existing knowledge. Again, that entry behaviors and learner characteristics, but also when we get to step 5, our instructional strategies, and also step 4, our learning outcomes or learning objectives. We can build on what we learned before. We create, we are able to, we need those past skills and basic knowledge to continue forward. And we can apply them in new situations and environments if we have that infrastructure, if we have those, what's the word that they use sometime? I'll think of it. How we build on those skills and knowledge over time. And again, you can click through and read more about the cognitive perspective, but it really is because we think about learning and we almost do a sort of we don't just learn by rewards and negative feedback. We learn and we aren't just affected by our developmental level, but we are thinking and consciously making use of our skills and knowledge. Now, you might ask, why would I use dogs for this example? And the fact is that dogs do appear to think things through. They do actually, like I said, Tommy learned to use facial expressions to teach me, to communicate with me what he wanted, what he wants. And I think many of you do have experience with animals who have done that, and even crows. Birds can do that. They learn to change their behavior to communicate, to teach us things. The social cognitive perspective builds on the Jerome Bruner work. Albert Bandura and his team brought together all of these elements, the elements of behavioral, developmental, cognitive perspectives, and described how we learned from interacting with each other formally and informally. One of the things I challenge people to do at the beginning is to be self-reflective. Consider when you're learning, what's happening inside your head when you're learning. when you're teaching, what's happening when you're communicating? Are you teaching that other person? Are they learning when somebody's talking to you? Are they teaching you? Are you learning? It is my belief that almost everything we do socially is a form of teaching and learning. And it really is, I don't know, it changes the way you approach uh, communications when you uh, think about it that way. It makes, I think it's an interesting way of like doing anger management therapy. A friend of mine is a psychiatrist, and she says cognitive therapy is based on this idea of changing the dialogue, changing the teaching and learning that happens, changing the teaching and learning that happens when you're teaching yourself and learning from yourself, which is kind of interesting. It's extremely interesting. And a reminder, these little summaries are at the top of some very great amount of research and work that you can click through and find out more about if you are interested. So, going back to our amusing and entertaining and kawaii, the Japanese word for cute, is the concept that was researched that came out with the fact that we actually have higher IQ apparently when we have observed cute things. Tommy, one of the reasons that I use this for as an example is that he learned by observing. We did not teach him, we did not use operant conditioning. He was old enough, his developmental level was old enough, he was very intellectually curious and observant. Many dogs are very observant. And my husband was eating hazelnuts and he was using a nutcracker to crack them open. And Michael was cracking them open and giving him hazelnuts. And we did check. Hazelnuts are not poisonous to dogs. No, I don't care what the ASPCA or PETA told you. They are not poisonous. You do have to watch out because they get really gassy if they eat too many, and they can have digestive issues if they eat too many. Just like you can if you eat the equivalent amount of your body weight in nuts or any kind. There are nuts that are poisonous to dogs. They're not poisonous. They're what's the word they want? They can make them sick. Walnuts you got to be careful with, especially the shells, and don't feed them macadamia nuts. The high fat content is the problem with those. But hazelnuts are actually pretty innocuous, and they're actually something that wild dogs, wild canids, will eat when they're. All canids will eat certain amounts of plant matter. So let's talk about Tommy learning instead of my fielding the shouts of outrage at my dog eating nuts. He watched Michael, and Michael said, "No, I don't want to crack any more for you. You got to crack your own." And much to our surprise, he watched Michael with the tool. Now, granted, we're not cracking the nuts with our teeth, we're using a tool, but Tommy knows that his teeth can crack things. He's eaten milk bones and other crunchy snacks. He knows that he can break things. So he watched Michael, and Michael gave him a whole hazelnut, and he cracked it very carefully with the side of his teeth. As you can see in the picture, he dropped the hazelnut shells and the meat right in the middle. You can see that with three pieces of shell around it. He very carefully picks up the meat and leaves the shells for me to step on when I'm barefoot on the carpet. The interesting thing is, when Tuppence came to live with us, he taught her how to crack and eat hazelnuts also. So we watched that happen. The psychology of learning, the constructivist perspective, is really the grandparent of and makes use of all these perspectives. John Dewey and his team. The interesting thing is that it's only been in the last 2 decades, I think, that John Dewey's really gotten cachet in academic circles. The idea that I think there was so much money going into attempts to quantify learning, to find out how you could make it happen rather than how you could shape it and create it. I think people wanted shortcuts, but there are not really shortcuts. Learning happens, and it takes a whole lot of work for it to happen. Teaching happens, and it can take a whole lot of work for teaching to happen. you can't force teaching and learning. You can try, but I think that's called torture, not teaching and learning. But that's my opinion. The constructivist perspective is that all everything is learner centered and includes the individual learner's entry behaviors and learner characteristics as a practical starting point for creating teaching and learning. So you take all the perspectives and you look at the users, you look at the learners and start from their point of view. What kinds of rewards and negative behavior will affect them? When we talk about motivation in step 5, the pre-instructional activities, what kind of rewards can you give? A's, getting more money for their work. What kind of negative interaction? Failure where it matters. Um, can you give any sort of operant conditioning to a specific user? Having privileges taken away if they don't learn to go to bed on time for children. Um, the dog not being allowed up on the couch if it has failed to learn that it can't pee or chew on the couch. I'm thinking about that right now because I'm actually sitting on my couch while I record. And when Tuppence was a puppy, she started chewing on the wood arms of my love seat, and she learned not to do that because whenever she started it, I told her down. She couldn't be up, and she learned that she could only stay up if she wasn't chewing. So that was kind of interesting. But I used that based on what would make her that what would reward the reward for good behavior was stronger than any negative thing I could have done. I could have hit her or I could have yelled at her, but all it would have done is made her afraid. She's a very she was a rescue from a puppy mill, and she's got all those problems with these really weird fears. And she's afraid of doors. She's afraid of cars. She's afraid of weed whackers. She's afraid of toddlers. So you can't, but by making somebody really afraid, they don't, especially a puppy mill dog, making her more afraid is not going to teach her not to chew on the couch. She's going to learn something, but it's not the specific thing that you want her to learn. So maybe a little bit long-winded of an explanation, but I hope you get the idea. So the importance of instructional design is really made clear when we start thinking about how people learn. We need to plan for that. We can't just set out prescriptions, a prescription for how to do it. Back when I was growing up, it was just common knowledge that if you wanted to train a dog not to go to the bathroom in the house, you had to rub its nose and you had to punish it. That turns out actually it doesn't work. All it teaches the dog is that you're perfectly willing to hurt it. What happens why we were successful back when we were trying those things is that we were then throwing them outside. So what they learned was the throwing outside was what they learned from. You go outside to do this, not here. The punishment had no effect whatsoever, and that's research based information. So you want to think about how people really learn. How do they build on what they already know? How can you, as a teacher, build on what your students, your learners, already know? How can you, as a learner, understand what else you need to learn or how to learn from other people through observation, through communication, and being learner centered? When you're a teacher, you also want to be aware of how you learn. What would happen if somebody did that to you? What would happen if somebody rubbed your nose in something to tell you that you wanted them to do something else? If you want a positive outcome, a negative action is not almost never the right thing to do. Analyzing the contents and skills or combinations of content and skills that need to be taught within the context of those specific learners. Once you've identified your learners, a path tends to open up if you're paying attention. And it really ultimately is about planning for specific learners. That's very difficult to find out who your specific learners are in certain situations. When I teach, I send out the entry behavior and learner characteristic surveys. Almost everything I teach, I try to do that, but you can't always get that in advance of designing the class. I tend to use that information to do future designs to find out who my students are. And sometimes you get the wrong information. You end up with a group of learners that, in fact, that instructional design didn't work for. Going to be I'm going to be doing a proposal to do a presentation on that. I'm going to turn a failure to do accurate in learner-centered design into a teachable moment for myself and my team on my grant project. I hope to be able to share some of that with you. So you have to think about also creating or otherwise preparing the instructional materials, thinking about developmental levels, thinking about ways you can build rewards and negative feedback into the instructional materials, thinking about things that engage people's sense of pleasure in learning. Think about ways in which that you can use things that they already know, skills they already have to add to their experience with those tools that you're using. Those tools are just tools. A stick in the mud, a stick in the sand is as good as a computer to use as a teaching tool, unless you have, it's the way you design the instruction. In fact, I think sometimes, how could I teach this class using a stick in the sand? I think I could. Because it's about the core issue is communication. The other thing you have to think about is evaluating the instruction. That's where my proposal for my analysis of failure is coming in. I evaluated the instruction. What I did failed because I didn't recognize the learners. I missed a very key point about my learners, and that was the amount of time and also the amount of attention they could give to the instruction in the form that it was. I made the assumption that people would actually dedicate 10 hours a week to the instruction, and in fact it turned out they would have liked to, and they said they would like to on their entry behavior and learner characteristics surveys that they did, but they turned out to only actually have between 3 and 5 hours, with more like 3 hours. So the instruction, the goals and the objectives for that instruction have not changed, but the way the instruction is designed is going to have to change, and it's already being changed. So evaluating that, you need to be aware of what you assumed your learners were, who your learners were, and then how they actually turned out to be. You need to use those learning perspectives to think very clearly as possible about how you can meet the needs of an identified group of learners. Now, this was a very long lecture. I usually like to have shorter lectures, but this was very difficult. My using PowerPoint for my slides sort of dictated how long I could go with this. This is the final picture, the final kawaii of Tuppence. That's her. She had a sock monkey toy that a friend gave her, but this is her after we went to puppy class with many other dogs, set up with a professional dog trainer helping us, and her best buddy at puppy training was a 3-month-old Rottweiler puppy, who was her best buddy, and they played and they learned well together. They actually they sort of rewarded each other. Hey, look, I can sit. Or the moose would look at Tuppence, who had already learned down, and he's like, oh, I can do that. So they fed back and forth to each other. But that learning took a lot of energy, and this was, I actually had to carry her. She was also afraid of staircases. I did have to carry her down the stairs from the puppy class, which was on the 2nd floor, and she laid like this in the car. I put her in her bed, but I think she was overheated, so she got out onto the floor. So consider our learners, the energy level they have. My learners that I'm working with on my grant project, that was the reason I wore them out. I gave them too much work to do, considering that they were adults with full-time jobs, families, and many others who were also taking other continuing education classes. So consider how much energy your learners actually have to put into it. So I hope I didn't wear you out too much with this lecture, and I'll talk to you again from the next one.